Young people getting addicted to their smartphones is rapidly growing.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Scorpion Movement podcast. And for this episode, the 21st one, we have author T.Y. Lee, who is the author of Return of the Rooftop Koreans, which is a graphic novel. The novel primarily did well on startup platforms like Kickstarter and Indiegogo, and T.Y. Lee has now reached the production stage where the novel is pretty much finished. He is doing interviews about the subject and sort of engaging in public discourse about it. He is also promoting the book. So several links of the book will be down in the description, but primarily because our podcast is intertwined on the intersection between culture and art, we wanted to ask T.Y. Lee about a few, questions for the inspiration of his book and other pertinent details. So T.Y. Lee, thank you and welcome to the podcast. So thank you very much for joining the show. And could you tell us a little bit more about yourself and who you are as an author?
So hello, Scorpion Movement. Thanks for having me on. And what I really love about your movement is it's the intersection of um culture and design art. And as for me, I come from a comic book background, and comic books have always been like a way for both readers and creators to like explore philosophy, society, and culture in a visual, almost raw form. And that's kind of what really drew me into comic books. So a bit more about me is, I'm a second generation Korean American writer and entrepreneur. I am the co-founder of a company called Anti-Woke Books, which is a independent publisher dedicated to bold, unfiltered storytelling across books, comics, and graphic novels. And as Jacob mentioned earlier, I have a book called Return of the Rooftop Koreans, which is a 140-page full-color graphic novel that revolves around a new generation of rooftop Koreans who take arms to protect their community in the face of chaos and injustice. It's a story that speaks to resilience, identity, survival, all in a chaotic world. It's a book that exemplifies essentially what dissident art is all about.
Yeah, and I believe it's based on the real 1992 historical events of the so-called Rooftop Koreans. So I found the proposition for the book very interesting because clearly it amalgamated some traction. I looked through your Kickstarter as well as your Indiegogo. It seemed that you put a lot of effort into making the promotional material as well. I saw some cards that you had made. The pages themselves look very much structured. There are different sections. It was broken down into the different components of the book. You seem to put a lot of updates into it. So. I'm just wondering around what time did the, idea for the book come about, and when did you start making it?
So this is kind of like an idea that I always had for a very long time. Obviously, well, to start with, let me give a bit of a backstory with the 1992 LA riots because chances are some of the listeners may not be familiar with those events.
Hmm.
So essentially, in 1992, there was a guy named Rodney King who, unfortunately, let's just say, did not make some very good life choices, and there were four police officers who ended up, um, beating the crap out of him. Like they took things way too far.
Hmm.
However, there was a good Samaritan who did film the entire incident, and you know, obviously, this incident sparked a lot of outrage with the public, and eventually, these four police officers, who beat the crap out of Rodney King, were eventually acquitted of all charges, which made things way worse. And that eventually led to protests, which initially started off peaceful, but those protests eventually kind of escalated into violence, looting, arson, rioting, and you know, during the chaos, there were lots of like gangs of criminals looting businesses, as I mentioned, burning parts of the city down. And unfortunately, the LAPD, they were really, really overwhelmed. So they decided to like focus mostly on protecting richer, wealthier neighborhoods like Beverly Hills and Fairfax, and the rest of LA was pretty much abandoned and left on their own, especially Koreatown. So many Korean American business owners they decided that the only way to protect their businesses and their livelihoods was to um, station themselves on top of the rooftops of their stores while holding guns. And this eventually like deterred rioters from like looting or attacking their stores. However, unfortunately, over 60 people were killed during the LA riots. It was a very big tragedy. And eventually these, iconic Korean American business owners who, stood on top of the rooftops of the stores holding guns, they kind of like, became like this iconic cultural um, type of thing. And, they became later known as like the Rooftop Koreans. So the graphic novel that I wrote is kind of it's like a fictional story that's inspired by the true story of the Rooftop Koreans from, 1992, but it's set in like the present day, which is like revolves around like a new generation of rooftop Koreans. And obviously as a child, I pretty much grew up in the 90s, and I know I look like really, really young, but I'm actually a lot older than I look. So in case you're wondering what my secret is, wear lots of sunscreen. So anyways,
Right.
anyways, I grew up in the 90s, and I wasn't in LA at the time. I was actually living in the DC, Fairfax area, which is on the other side of the country. And I was really young when the LA riots were happening. But, I, heard stuff from my parents about like all the, terrible stuff going on in LA. And, there were many Korean Americans who were murdered during the LA riots. And, this story kind of like stuck with me throughout my entire life. And eventually, many, many years later, we, get to, know, people like Mike Brown or George Floyd, and you know, obviously, they were killed by police brutality, which resulted in lots of rioting. And these riots kind of like reminded me of the LA riots, and especially during COVID-19 and the George Floyd riots.
Yeah, in 2020.
Yeah, yeah, like that like really reminded me of like the Rooftop Koreans. It's like, hey, maybe it's time for the Rooftop Koreans to make a comeback. And that's kind of when the idea first emerged in my head for this graphic novel. And obviously because like when it comes to like riots, race relations, police brutality, like it's a very sensitive subject. So
Yeah.
obviously like no mainstream publisher would want to publish a book like this. So I realized the only way to get a book like this published is to do it myself and self-publish it, which is why I created my own independent publishing company called And I Woke Books. And I decided for my very first book, it will be a book called Return of the Rooftop Koreans, which is kind of, as I mentioned, a new generation of rooftop Koreans protecting their neighborhoods and their communities from rioters and looters. And that's kind of where the idea originally came from.
Yeah, that's fascinating, man. Relating to your comments on the 2020 riots, yeah, I was just about to say that like there was like this huge parallel, and maybe that reminded you a bit of what was happening more during your childhood. But no, thinking of the thought that you had regarding publishers, that's definitely a big deal because I've noticed that in a lot of situations, sending things works from your authorship, books, novellas, comic books, stuff like that, anything that you make yourself. Two publishers is a very difficult process. The big four publishers in the United States, they barely, look at the amounts of submissions that they have because every single year there's thousands of English graduates from college who think they're going to become like the next big author. Um, I would say become the next big J.K. Rowling, but I don't think they like her very much either now as well. So everyone seems to think that they have like the next great novel, and the publishers don't really know how to filter for all of it. And what they do in a lot of the situations is they just filter what's going to sell the best. And obviously, controversial content, they have no guarantee whether it's going to sell well or whether they're going to get bad press for it. So it can, create two situations. Either you have a really good book that is very thought-provoking provoking and gets a lot of people, interested in history and what's going on, and have people, have a different outlook. It's going to affect them in some way because that's what fiction is meant to do, which is probably what you meant to do with your book. Or it's like a big, riot because someone, ironically, because someone publishes an article about it, and then people complain about it, and then the publisher has to take it down, and it's just difficult for everybody. And a lot of the big major publishing companies don't want to take that risk. So I presume that you wanted to start your own independent publishing company so that you would have a greater incentive in the profits, so that you would have a greater control over your narrative. Because even if you went to a small publisher, not only would your book have limited capacity, it wouldn't sell that well, but they would take a big cut of the money that you earn from it. So I suppose that's where independent funding came in. So around what time did you start the campaign, started letting people know about your idea for the book? Did you already like sketch out everything, or like the storyline, or just the basic drawings for what the characters will look like before you started advertising the idea, or did they just come out sort of at the same time? I'm curious about that.
So when it came to my process, I first started with the script. So I kind of, created like the plot of like what's gonna happen and the storyline. I came up with the characters, and then from there, I did work with a professional editor to, further refine that script to make it better. And then after that, I hired an artist from Chile to kind of like at first like design the
Yeah.
characters, drawing them, but I would provide him like descriptions, like this description would say like the character looks like this, and this is what so and so character is wearing. So he would like create these character design sheets, you know, and then from
Yes.
there, um, we started with like the storyboarding, like like what's gonna happen on like each page, like um, so these storyboards, they'll just be kind of like these very simple sketches of like the events and how like the story unfolds across the pages. And from there, he did the line art, like drawing the actual lines, penciling and inking. And then I worked with another artist. His name is Donnie. He's from Indonesia, and he did all the colors, so he colored
Yeah.
everything in. And then I worked with another artist who did like the letters, and by letters I mean word balloons on sound effects. So
Yeah.
that's kind of how it all came together. And then once the art was complete, of course you had to like format the pages to like get them to be like a print friendly or digital friendly format. And essentially, it's now done. And when it comes to creating comic books, it is a very you know tedious process. There's definitely a lot of work that needs to be done, and I kind of you know underestimated just how much time and effort would be needed to create this project. And while the book was being created, I did kind of like start promoting it on social media. So I started like an X account, an Instagram, a Facebook, and I created like lots of marketing materials to obviously promote the book. So that was essentially kind of like how the process went.
Yeah, that seems incredibly arduous, and I was literally about to make the comment regarding the before you even mentioned Indonesia, I was about to say a lot of the people who draw these panels and who are really good at it are from Indonesia or Malaysia for some reason. I don't know why, but whenever I just wanted like graphic design work done, the people who make the best ones are somehow always from that region. And I was just gonna say, I think it's kind of funny that you found someone from Chile. Usually they're always from Indonesia and Malaysia. And then the next one, you're just like, oh, there we go. Like there's always going to be, they're really good at manga and anime and comic book, or what do you call it? The manhwa. All of the different styles of just like graphic novels. They're really good at that. So yeah, so I suppose that answered my question. There's a lot of work that you did during, the initial phases of the book, while a lot of the stuff was already completed. You began reaching out to all these people. So I do suppose it's a very arduous process to reach out to all these people at once and try to sort of coordinate your efforts. It's also very difficult, I assume, because there's a lot of money and time and investment that goes into making a book like this. It's very important to have public funding or funding of some sort when you're an independent publisher, because you have to have the feeling that not only are people going to appreciate your work and buy your book, but it also creates a way for you to actually pay these artists and to have a way to get on with this. That's a difficult situation in a lot of cases for many authors. Um, I just wanted to ask in general, since you seemed so invested in the process early on, what was it like your first gradual exposure to graphic novels? Why a graphic novel? Because you seem like the type of guy that's very, very interested in like the actual story and making it work and selling it. So why did you decide on the graphic novel genre to be the way that you publish your book?
That's a good question. So, on why the graphic novel, I feel like there's something that graphic novels and comics have that like other mediums of storytelling do not have because you know like when it comes to like a prose novel, it's just a bunch of text on a page and um the way like a story unfolds in a prose novel is kind of different from how it's in graphic novel because with a prose novel um in a way when you're like reading the book you're kind of like the co-author in a way because you're kind of like creating the images in your head as
Yeah.
you're reading the text. So that's kind of like the creative process. But the problem with the prose novels, you don't have as much control with, I guess, like how the reader sees and interprets the story. But with a comic book, you have more control over that because when you're reading a comic book, the only thing that the reader is actually like imagining or creating in their heads would be like what comes in between these two panels. So if there's like a panel here and a panel here, they would imagine like what happens between these two panels. But like, with the comic books, you just like have greater control over like what the reader sees and envisions. Like to me, that's like the main advantage of comic books. Like you have greater control over like how the reader sees and interprets the story. So that's kind of why I went with this medium. And another one is, obviously something like Return of the Rooftop Koreans. It's going to be very action oriented and it's, like a lot harder to convey action through prose than it
Yeah.
is with images. You can like do that a lot better. And because it's so action oriented, it like kind of fits the comic book genre better than let's say a prose novel. And and I'll say like another reason is like I felt like this story would like bring something new to the world of comics because when it comes to comic books, most of them are like either superheroes, fantasy, science fiction, or horror. And there just really aren't a lot of comic books out there that are like these grounded, realistic, vigilante based stories. I mean, of course there are some comics like that, but vast majority are not. So this is like something that's different and unique for the comic book world. Whereas with novels, there are lots of grounded action stories. So I felt like this story would be better told within like the comic book format. That's kind of why I decided to go with comic books rather than doing a prose novel.
That makes a lot of sense, relatively speaking. There was something else that we talked about on a previous podcast, me and my co-host, and it was that a lot of people, and I think this relates heavily to what you were saying, a lot of people are gravitating towards stuff like dystopian fiction or like action fictional stuff these days because they like to sublimate the feelings of discontent that they have. So whenever we see something on like television where there's something really bad happening, or we see people just fighting over topics, whether they be cultural, whether they be political, stuff like the stuff that's been recently happening. We see a lot of people wanting to sort of have an outlet to that. And a lot of the ways in which it casts itself into the art world, into the literary world, is that a lot of people recently have been reading things like dystopian fiction. So the rise of new novel genres, new series. Like we had the Hunger Games around 10 years ago. Then we had the return of more classic dystopian novels. We had 1984. We had Brave New World. These books started selling at record numbers. Animal Farm by George Orwell. We had all these sort of like dark topics come about. And in the recent years, we've seen a return of a lot of action films that aren't Marvel, aren't DC. We see a lot of very, rebellious narratives where people are sort of just revolting against the system. And even if you look at the recent Oscar or Emmy winners, you see a lot of series that are people about that are fighting back against something that has happened to them. And in a lot of cases many years ago, these tended to be narratives where, these were people fighting against some sort of tyrant that was biting at their neck. But more than recently, we've seen narratives that are very similar to your book, where it's just people that are caught in the unfortunate circumstances of something else happening. So the sort of vibe that I get with your book, The Return of the Rooftop Koreans, is that these were people who are unfortunately affected by the circumstances around them. So going back to like the actual LA riots, from what I remember reading about them, which isn't quite a lot, but from what I do remember reading, it was that, as you were saying, the local police department was dispatched to some of the wealthier areas, and the poor areas were left undefended. And because this is the United States, of course, you have the aims to actually defend yourself and your own property. And in a lot of cases, these people became viewed as heroes because they were sort of, just sort of defending their way of life, trying to make a living, defending the concept of the American dream in the shadow of what is probably like a sign of a decaying society. When you have people beating each other on the streets and stealing and looting, we don't think of that as civilized. But coming to America and actually trying to make a living for yourself, that tends to be like the cultural ideal for what people aspire to do. So thematically, that arose a great awe. So I think in your book, you're combining both of these things that I talked about, where you're sublimating a lot of these concerns that people have about the everyday world, and then you're also giving leeway for people to actually recognize that uh, there can be something admirable among something very chaotic. This is something that several other authors that we've had on our podcast also have talked about recognizing the beautiful from the sour, and then also like changing all these themes. So I suppose I want to talk about how all these themes intersect in your novel. I looked upon like the different style sheets and the cards that I mentioned just previously, like 10 minutes ago. But I think in a lot of cases, we also try to think of like the general theme of how the characters interact, what's going on. How did you manage to fit, I guess, like a greater world within your book? I suppose that you were designing a lot of it, sketching a lot of the story, as you previously mentioned. You were giving the ideas for so many of the characters. So how did you decide what role they would play, what their, arcs would be? Were they inspired by real people in your life? Were they inspired by characters that you saw on television or any particular other graphic novels or prose novels? What sort of drew you to creating this story?
So yeah, that's definitely a very good question. So, Return of the Rooftop Koreans is definitely, inspired by some dystopian fiction stories. And, it definitely is about like the main character, the main protagonist, his name is Ernest Guan,
Mm-hmm.
and he's essentially, a guy who was caught up in a very bad situation. Um, he's essentially like the reluctant hero, just an everyday normal guy who is essentially forced to become a hero. He's, a grocer, forced to become a soldier. And what I like about these type of narratives is that like these type of characters are like more relatable rather than some sort of like, you know, Mary Sue type of gung ho type of character. Like they're just not relatable. Like I really want the protagonist, Ernest Guan, to be like this, everyday man. He owns and runs a small Korean grocery store, and unfortunately, he finds himself in a very bad situation. So in his case, basically, two thugs decide that they're going to come into his store and collect protection money. They're demanding that he hands money over to them, and both Ernest and his wife Sunny tell these two thugs that we don't have any money. Our business is struggling right now. We can't afford to pay you. And then one of these thugs, he says, there are other ways to pay. And he looks at Ernest's daughter, um, named Minnie, who is 8 years old, and
Oh,
implying that he you
yeah.
know and and by the way, this whole like situation that I described was actually quite common between 1910 to 1945 during the Japanese occupation of Korea, except
Hmm.
in um, gang members or thugs, it would normally be Japanese soldiers barging into Korean businesses or Korean homes and demanding that they pay protection money. And if they don't, there were other ways to pay. And I'm sure you heard about the stories of the comfort women who were actually really,
Indentured, yeah, yeah, yeah. There we go.
yeah. And that's kind of where that came from. So, essentially in the story, Ernest Guan, he has to make a decision, and obviously he's not going to let these thugs take his daughter away. So, he eventually finds himself in a situation where he has no choice but to kill them. So he ends up shooting and killing both of them. And one of these thugs was a black man, kind of like Mike Brown or George Floyd, and the media essentially decides that they're going to try to like martyr this guy
Yeah.
while trying to villainize Ernest Guan as some sort of racist, that if this was some sort of targeted hate crime, that he killed the guy because he is a racist. So the media basically smears Ernest Guan, and they incite riots all across LA, which you know basically resemble the 1992 LA riots. And this kind of leads Ernest Guan as well as many other Korean Americans to once again take up arms and stand on top of the rooftops of their stores, and to protect them. So it's kind of like a repeat of history. And as for the character of Ernest Guan, he was mostly inspired by like my uncle, because my uncle was like, in a way, it was kind of like the father figure in my life, because my biological dad was kind of a deadbeat, wasn't really involved that much.
Hmm.
So my uncle kind of became like my dad, and in a way, I would say like his personality really like inspired the protagonist of Ernest Guan, and that's kind of where like I got the idea of him. So I kind of like imagined my uncle being in this situation and kind of you know created this whole story around that. So that's kind of where the story and characters come from.
Yeah, I guess it is a huge advantage making the main protagonist sort of relatable to the general audience because when we see a story about a man being bitten by a radioactive spider, it's not like, yeah, I can't really relate to that. But when we're seeing someone that just like works a normal job and we see them in a difficult situation, we can more so emphasize with them and empathize with them. And I suppose during, when we're talking about a theme that is as controversial as this one, it's very important to make the reader sympathize with the main character rather than villainizing them because we instantly come with the assumption that the reader may, be of a different background, they may interpret the story differently. And the more exposure that we sort of have to the everyday life that the character lives, and the more we throw them out into this hero's journey, the more we see, life from their perspective, the more we can integrate ourselves into the world of the book because we're no longer thinking as ourselves. We're thinking of, okay, this is probably also what I do in this given situation. So that's also quite interesting. And what you mentioned about basing one of the characters off of your uncle is also quite fascinating because I see that a lot of writers do that. And a lot of readers, in the way that you mentioned when we were speaking about bros, they tend to sort of insert characters that they dream up of in their own head, sort of like being the co-authors, into the story, because up until the character is described as looking this way or looking that way, we don't really know what the character looks like. Until the character is like given distinct physical features, we don't know what they look like. The only thing we can do is assume and fill in the gaps, sort of hallucinate what's happening in the story in our own heads. And that is the difficulty of prose. So I suppose in a lot of these situations, representing it in a comic book or a graphic novel fashion is especially forgiving because it allows us to do a bit more of these like details and whatnot. But because you were so heavily involved in the process of like generally designing the characters and also managing the art team behind this book while also getting money for it, advertising it, sort of publishing it by yourself with your own publishing company, which adds a whole nother layer to this. Were there any like changes that you made in the story throughout this process? Was it like mostly a linear process where you did this step by step, or were there times when you looked back and you said, "Wait, let me replace this with this"? And what were those changes?
So for the most part, I would say it was mostly a linear process. So it was kind of like, well, I guess I kind of like approached it like a waterfall process. Are you familiar with like the waterfall mythology?
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's kind of how I did it. So it's like kind of like in the waterfall mythology, it's divided into different stages. Like once, one stage is done, you can't go back. So that's kind of how I approached it because I wanted to make sure that, this comic actually got done. Like there are like I guess you call them like perfectionists that they haven't like completed anything. Like they're still like constantly
Yeah.
polish up their idea and trying to make it better and you know
You
they
learn
just
by doing. You learn by doing.
yeah, yeah. So I feel like with me, I decided like I want to like divide the whole process into stages, and once one stage is done, I do not go back. Like it's done. I have to keep moving forward because otherwise, this is gonna be like a process where it's never gonna end. Like, I've worked in corporate America and I've seen like some like short projects that should only take like 2 weeks end up taking like 6 months due to like
Yeah.
scope creep and endless amounts of revisions. So I want to like keep the revisions to a minimum. So when I like, once I like conceptualized the story, I was done. Then I began like writing it. So while I was writing the story, I did not like change the plot. I just kind of just started just focusing on like the dialogue and kind of like further fleshing out the story I came up with. And then, I of course told you I create like these descriptions and then I'll send it to the line artist who kind of created the character designs and how the characters will look. And I would also work with him to kind of like make some revisions to the way the characters look. And then, like once the character designs were finalized, they were finalized. Like, and then we just moved to the next step, which was actually, drawing the comic. So that's kind of how I approach things. Like, I just don't want to like something to go on like forever. So that's kind of what I did.
Yeah, I suppose it's the bureaucracy in a lot of cases when you see it in corporate America where people just sort of go back and forth, back and forth. Not to go off on a little tangent, but I see that a lot of people replicate the ways that they think about like everyday life into art. So from very early on when we're in school, we're told like, oh, you need to write your report this way. It needs to be as perfect as possible. You get more marks if you put that many sentences in. If you put, these kinds of things in. If you put loops around the words that, you've recently learned. Stuff like that. From very, very early on in primary or elementary school, we're told these are the specific ways to make something work. And then the people who are quite good at that, they reread it over and over and over and over again. Whereas the process of actually writing something doesn't quite work that way. As I mentioned before, you sort of learn by doing, and I'm sure you're very familiar with this because I'm sure that you obtained like a way better view of what it means to like write a book or design a graphic novel or manage all these teams or even start your own publishing company throughout the process of doing it. I don't reckon that you had much experience starting publishing companies prior to when you realized like, hey, I'm gonna need another way to publish this book. You sort of just learn it all going along, going along. You don't really plan out for any of this. And then as you do it, you sort of think, oh, I'm quite good at this. Let me just narrow it down to what I'm going to do. And then for this waterfall process that you yourself have mentioned, then we're going to mark this as finished and mark that as finished and slowly progress through this. Because constantly going back creates the 95% of the American population that is just like, well, that's nice that you wrote a book. I always wanted to write a book, but I never got around to it. And what they mean by that is they wrote a few pages, then they got bored, then they, thought to themselves, oh, maybe this will not be perfect. Like, even if it isn't perfect, most people don't read perfect fiction. The vast majority of fiction that people read is quite bad. So when we think about, the idea of perfectionism, you described a really good method to get it going. I'm just sort of curious, did you use any other methods? When did you actually focus on writing it? Because I'm sure that you had other commitments in your life, you had other things going on. As the time goes on, as the graphic artists design the actual characters, as they put, the bubbles on the page, time passes. So when did you get the time to really work on this and flesh out this world? And would you say that was most difficult in the very beginning, when you were sort of designing the story and thinking of how the pieces were going to fall through together? Or was it more difficult at the end when you were polishing it up?
I would say it's more difficult in the beginning, definitely, because the hardest step is actually the first step. And
Mhm.
oftentimes people they don't take the first step because they feel like now isn't the right time. Maybe there's a better time. Maybe I should wait to take the first step later when there's just a better time. And the problem with that line of thinking is the reality is there will never be a better time. There will never be a good time to do something. Like if you're gonna take the first step, you gotta do it right now. A lot of people they have this you know the old saying, think before you act or
Yep.
look before you leap. You know,
Hmm.
this is something that we're all taught in school, but the problem with these two mythologies is that they're just really kind of dumb because the thing is the guy that acts without thinking will do better than the guy that thinks before he acts. That's usually how it works because oftentimes the guy that thinks before he acts never actually makes it to the acting stage. They just simply just think and then think more and more and more and they never get anything done. Meanwhile,
Hmm.
the idiot who decides that they're going to just act without thinking will actually get something done. It won't be the best thing, but at least they'll get something done. So, um, my advice for like aspiring writers out there is to think, I mean, to act without thinking and to leap
Yeah.
without looking. Like, you got to just do it. You know, just don't worry about thinking because obviously overthinking is the thing that hurts the vast majority of writers. And um, if something isn't good, you just got to keep going. Just keep writing, 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 and eventually, you'll have like an editor that can like kind of take your work and make it better. So obviously, you should not just worry about whether or not something's good. Just worry about getting it done first. Like that's the first thing that you got to do. You got to create a you know, an an MVP, a minimum viable product. So focus on creating the minimum viable product first, and then you can focus on polishing up later. So that's kind of the approach I took. As for me, I did mention that what really inspired me to create this graphic novel was the riots of 2020, and so that's kind of when I first like conceptualized the idea, and then I would say it's like when I really decided to really like get this up to speed was I would say in like maybe like early 2022 is like when I really decided that hey, I'm gonna just do it. Like I'm just gonna take the first step. So once I took the first step, I just kept going. I was like, I took the first step. I got to keep going. I don't want to, my efforts to be wasted. So that's kind of the approach I took. And yes, of course, taking the first step is very difficult, but at least I did take the first step though.
Yeah, it's nice that you brought forward the idea of like sort of action primacy because that's something that we talk a lot about on this channel. Because this relates to your book quite heavily, in my opinion, because there are a lot of situations where people on the outside world just sort of act without thinking, and a lot of the times that we don't notice, that actually leads to them, ending up in jail or whatever, because sometimes they do something very stupid. But then there's occasional circumstances where these people, when they take that gamble, they actually take to, as is often the case with gambles, as we discussed earlier, they actually tend to win quite well. I suppose it is a dangerous game when you act first without thinking, but in a lot of situations when it's between, making a great work of art and then hyperfixating on it forever and never finishing it, when it's between doing something great or standing still. When it's that sort of double or nothing scenario, and you're already in a bad situation, it's way better to act without fixating on the consequences too much because you'll always have time to deal with the consequences later. And that is advice that goes very much against what the vast majority of society teaches us. They teach us to be very careful because when you have, a worker in a corporate structure, the less risks they make, the less risks the company makes. And because they tend to hire people who are sort of, average intelligence, they can't afford to have these people making small, big risk decisions. Even if there is one genius in the crowd, they don't want that genius to sort of outshine the master and do better than the CEO would in managing that company. That tends to fall on deaf ears in corporate America. But it also relates quite heavily to like the entire idea of your book where you could think of the original inspiration for the book and how these people sort of acted immediately in defending their businesses and their property when they saw that there were people outside looting and stealing. They could have thought thousands of different consequences of that potential action. They could have thought, well, how will this go with the law? How will this go like publicly? Will people villainize us? But you know, once you see people going outside and just breaking everything, you're not gonna think of yourself too much like, hey, what am I gonna do? Is it morally right to hit the guy with a bottle over the head who's just trying to steal everything from my store? You know, at that point, the normal human impulses kick in, and you just do what your nature, what your biology has programmed you to do. And a lot of cases, that means acting without concerning like the huge monkey brain. It's just reacting on your base instincts. In a lot of cases, that is actually advantageous because the primary way to respond to rapid action, the way that criminals do it, the way that a lot of looters do it, the way that a lot of people who are not concerned with others' health and well-being do it, is with a torsion of rapid action. You can't really, you know, be the bigger guy every single time and during a fight when somebody is trying to hit or punch you, say, wait, we can resolve this peacefully because when you open up your arms like this, you're just letting yourself get hit one more time. So I suppose action primacy ties into the concept of your book as a whole, and it ties down to your main character, who he himself did something to defend his family, acting on his prime impulses without consulting that monkey brain too much, where we tend to think about the consequences and the entire process and how to act perfectly. Meanwhile, in real life, there are no perfect situations. There's a lot of messed up situations, and we need to act on them in a certain way. So I suppose you know, this ties into how a lot of people view America from the outside because there's that concept of like the American dream of starting your own business, but there is also the concept of that immense amount of like violence, and I'm sure. Well, I want to ask first, sort of about your background growing up in America. I suppose that you were born in America, but if so, I would like to know a little bit more about that and how you just sort of experienced American culture from the point of view as a second generation immigrant. What did you see about it that was quite different to what you were taught at home? How did you experience it differently than your peers at school may have did, and how did that influence the book? That's what I'm most curious about right now.
So for me, I was born in the States, so I was born in the East Coast in the
Mhm.
USA, and I was born to Korean American parents, and you know, growing up in a Korean American home, it's definitely very different than growing up in like a in like Korea or growing up in like a traditional American home. And the thing is, where I grew up it was in like the Fairfax, Virginia area, which does have a very large Korean American population, and it's a very I guess multicultural, very diverse area in the USA. And growing up, I did like have to interact with various different races and cultures, and I definitely noticed from an early age that there were like some like in-group biases, as certain groups tended to like stick together. Like I noticed that a lot of Koreans, they stick together. Um, Hispanic people stick together. White people stick together. Black people stick together, etc. And that's just kind of the way it is. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that, but that's just kind of just the way it is, and kind of like shaped my perception of how I view the world and race. And some of that does come across in my book, like this perception. And and another thing is like like growing up in this as like a Korean American, like I noticed that like the way the media portrays Korean Americans is very different from how like Korean Americans really are. Like I feel like what I mean is that like the way like Korean Americans in general like very 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 conservative, but the only like Korean American voices that are highlighted are more like liberal leaning voices, and sometimes they will take like a liberal leaning Korean American voice, and then they'll like amplify it and make it look like this person speaks for the entire Korean American community, which is not true at all. Like I just find that like very dishonest. And I think like a good example of this is I'm not going to like name any
Yeah.
names, but there was Well, actually, I'll just name some names. There's a guy named John Cho. He's an actor. I don't know if you ever seen the movie Harold and Kumar.
Yeah, I
And
recognize him. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So John Cho is kind of like oftentimes amplified by like Hollywood and the media as being like the voice of the Korean American people, even though his voice does not actually reflect the Korean American experience or Korean Americans in general. And
Mhm.
most Korean Americans see him as like some sort of scumbag and traitor, as he's always constantly calling Koreans racist and terrible people, and he's always you know belittling Korean Americans for being Christians, and his like overall view of like Korean Americans, as well as like his view of like the world, just does not represent like the Korean American experience, and it's just not right. And he also like wrote a prose novel about the LA riots, which he basically just villainizes Korean people. And like I wanted my like graphic novel to come out, kind of be like a counterpart to his prose novel, like portray like a more accurate vision of the Korean American experience compared to his novel. So that's like another thing that I want to mention.
Yeah, man. I feel like that's a common thing within America where you see like a small group of people that are usually like quite traditional in their leanings. And then we have, like third generation immigrants, people that are born in the United States. They think in English, they speak in English, they get taught their, native culture from parents that themselves were born in America. And then a lot of these people, they have enough money to go to university, and then they think of themselves as this sort of like model minority. They become news broadcasters. They begin speaking, on public television, on social media, and they begin getting labels for that group that they partially come from, or sometimes almost entirely come from, that the group itself does not want. And I saw this firsthand, sort of growing up in Florida, because there were a group of people that. You were very passionate about the fact that they hated the term Latinx because, in Spanish we have Latina and Latino, like we have that different gendered conjugation at the end. It's the same with pretty much all European languages, Italian, French, Spanish, Polish. All of these major languages have that differentiation between the female and the male, noun for something. And these days it's quite troublesome because in the English language, there's a lot of people who go beyond these like female and male terms. Simply because English had really never had that difference. We don't, call a tree feminine. We don't call a bike masculine. We don't have that differentiation because it never made quite sense. And English wanted to be as simple as possible, especially American English for the people that are incoming. But that also created a situation where America, as the main determiner of the world's culture, whenever we come across things such as like non-binary people, and we tend to refer to such situations, such people, when we come across things that fall outside like of the realm of what was previously conceived, new terms for things, translating those to other languages doesn't work very well because when you have something like Latino and Latina, that's not just them calling themselves male or female. That's literally how the language works. And for someone that mostly speaks in English, doesn't really interact with Spanish culture, to call a Spanish-speaking Latin person Latinx must be quite annoying because they're literally butchering your language to your face and telling you how to be more inclusive with your culture. It's no longer about them changing their culture and you having to accommodate. It's about them telling you how to act. And I suppose that can be very frustrating, even in my own experience of sort of having languages shoved and forced upon me and having to learn a little bit of like Spanish and Haitian Creole to get along in school because growing up in a very, very, very south of Florida where a lot of the people are like Caribbean, it's quite frustrating to have that imposed upon you. So I perfectly understand the sentiment. And regarding like the Koreans and John Cho, I believe that who you're referring to. It's quite interesting, and I didn't quite notice before I had like Korean friends who were born in Korea, that a lot of Korean families are actually like heavily Christian. And from what I understand from like Korean history, is that during the time of the Japanese subjugation and shortly after, during the Korean War and whatnot, a lot of these families were very heavily Christian. because it sort of demonstrated like that sort of conservatism of the time of wanting to stick to your own traditional like small groups and wanting to have that Korean language, that Korean, family to not be subjugated into the Japanese sphere of life, which is why up to this day, I believe South Korea had put several restrictions on like Japanese media, and as a result, it actually grew like its own like media industry. The Korean, media industry is so powerful that a lot of people in the West watch it, primarily because things like K-pop and K-dramas, they were created as a result of Japanese media being banned, whereas in the US, there was a lot of it coming in. So because of that uniqueness, a lot of people, tend to prioritize, Korean cultures, claiming that okay, this is something that we stick to, and that was very much the case during those aforementioned times during the Korean War, during the occupation, where a lot of people resorted to Christianity as something that was quite rebellious towards the Japanese. They were conservative in the terms that they wanted to stick together, have their own language, have their own people, have their own culture, but they also didn't want some sort of like religion or system of faith imposed upon them. And when the Japanese system, especially during World War II, was very much so like we worship the emperor, while the guards and the people who were protecting the emperor and acting on his behalf were actively robbing Koreans, that was not entirely a system that they could go along with. So because of this huge, tie to the West, it was very easy to spread Christianity from missionaries. Even before that time, in the 1800s, in I believe, like the Joseon dynasty and whatnot, a lot of these different like components of Korean, when you're translating when the Bible was translated into like Hangul, when you could read it, when you could spread it, a lot of it became like a core component of Korean Christian culture, because it was acted as like a defiance against Japan. And not to explain Korean history to you, Bill, but I'm just simply rephrasing the parts of it that I find extremely fascinating, because it's not, you wouldn't really think of an Asian country as being this deeply Christian, but and a lot of Americans do forget this, or they're just too ignorant understand it, I believe. You don't expect that to be the case, and in a lot of cases, it does go overshadowed. So, are there? I guess this sums me up to the question that I really wanted to ask. Are there other parts of the book that reveal like information about what life is as a Korean American, to that Americans wouldn't commonly understand? Are there like references to specific things or specific issues, or they're very heavy like dramatic topics regarding the process of sort of accomplishing that status quo American dream from nothing. Is there like a big thematic element of that in that book, and how does that tie back to Korean culture?
Um, yeah, but before I get into that, I do also want to ask you something. Like, I'm sure you probably noticed by now, and this kind of ties back to the Christian thing about
Hmm.
Korea. I'm sure you noticed that there's like Latin punctuation marks in the Korean language. Like, I'm sure you've seen Korean text with commas,
Yes.
periods, exclamation points, quotation marks, and stuff like that. That definitely like comes from like the Christian influence, as well as the because it was mostly the Christians that first started like incorporating Latin punctuation to the language, and
Yep.
that's like become like a huge part of the Korean language now. Like, you won't find Korean text without any Latin punctuation, and like it's also like kind of like changed how Korean people speak. Like, I noticed that like the younger generation of Koreans, they tend to like structure their sentences closer to like how
English.
sentences, yeah, yeah, and they just like change differently. Like, the way Korean is now, it's like it's become more Latinized now. So, anyways, I did want to point that out. And going back to like the American dream and things like that. The thing is like you know I'm sure you probably came across this in your research, that a lot of Korean Americans are small business owners, and that's just like very common for lots of Korean
Oh yeah.
Americans to like own like a liquor store or a dry cleaners or a
Oh yeah.
restaurant. Like, that's just really huge. And I once like asked my uncle about that, and he said that back in the day, no one would give us jobs, so we had to create our own. Like, that was like they had no other option but to be entrepreneurial and to start their own businesses by borrowing money from other family members and starting their own businesses. So that's kind of like where that culture came from, with every Korean American owning different stores. And I don't know if you ever read about Ice Cube and his
Yeah.
role in the LA riots. Like he wrote a song called Black Korea, which many people would say helped instigate the riots. And the thing is, shortly after the LA riots, I want to point out that Ice Cube is also like was back then like a spokesperson for like a liquor company. And because so many liquor stores are owned by Korean Americans, like after the LA riots, they decided that they would like boycott that company's liquors and not stock them in their stores. And that eventually resulted in Ice Cube essentially being canceled and fired as a spokesperson for this liquor brand. So I did want to bring that up. So like you'll be amazed like how many liquor stores even in the Denver area are like owned by Korean Americans. Like there's just a lot of them. Like that's just kind of the way it is. Like I don't know, it's really weird phenomenon. But um so that's kind of like the American dream for many Korean Americans was to like start their own business and to run that. Like that's become like the American dream. And with like second generation Korean Americans, many of them like work in corporate America rather than owning their own business. And a lot of them will like go to college and study law or business or um
Medicine.
yeah, STEM. And it's become like a very different culture. And as for me, I come from a tech background. That's where I work, and I've pretty much worked in tech my whole life. So so yeah, so it's kind of a bit different between the second generation Korean Americans that mostly work in corporate America versus the first generation Korean Americans that like they all own their own stores. So there's definitely like a difference there in how different groups perceive like the American dream.
hmm Yeah, I definitely suppose that there's this big entrepreneurial spirit among some immigrant groups where they just sort of come from their own country and they want to own something for once. They want to have a business. Especially because, on the old times, as you mentioned, it was a very common case, actually, that a lot of people wouldn't get hired from abroad for jobs. They needed to start their own jobs, and having a good amount of money from back home to bring and just sort of build something basic in the new country is definitely helpful for a lot of people. But there is very much a disconnect between that first and second immigrant group. In a lot of cases, I would just sort of theorize that it's because people who are born in the United States, no matter, what their primary ethnicity is, when they're raised by these sort of immigrant parents, when they're sort of infatuated with that idea of just sort of making it, eventually you start in blending very, very quickly. And I noticed that a lot of immigrants that are like people that are born to immigrant parents or people that move to the United States as children, they integrate a lot quicker than some people who are just American, as in they have no other identity. Because there are a lot of people that grew up in like more poorer cities, they have, little to no formal education, and they don't really have a drive to integrate into society. A lot of these people are very disadvantaged. A lot of these people face harsh life conditions, but a lot of them simply are in a situation where, it's not really their family's thing to integrate into society. But immigrants, primarily when you see them coming from Europe or especially Asia, you see a lot of them just trying to just sort of start something, build a structure for the children to follow. And I guess in a lot of cases, their children don't really fall into that line, as you mentioned. They go out and they do STEM and they do tech, and that's perfectly understandable for someone that basically considers themselves an American, having grown up in that culture, not being quite able to fit in into their home country as they mostly speak in English. I think that's a common sentiment among a lot of immigrants, and me coming from an immigrant family, that's especially impactful for me as well. But I would like to ask, how did the fact that a lot of Koreans, tend to own their own businesses, how did that? I suppose the question I'm asking is how did it affect the course of your story? How did it, develop and enshrine what the story was going to be about? Because surely the mission that you sort of want to accomplish with a work of fiction like this is you want to represent something that is quite, typical, something that people can recognize, something that people can relate to. We already discussed your main character and the protagonist and how you tried to make him relatable and seem like an everyday man. But do you think the fact that the entire story centers around the Rooftop Koreans, as they call them, which by this time is a very, popular thing to talk about. It is a sort of symbol of this, of all the symbol of all the things that we discussed, sort of defending the American dream against an unfortunate set of circumstances that has brought about you. Do you think the fact that this is such a symptom of Korean American culture, where they start their own businesses, and the fact that this book is about is based off of the 1992 LA riots and the comeback of that sort of spirit, do you think that is the reason why a lot of people supported the campaigns that you initially had on Kickstarter and Indiegogo? Like, do you think that was a major selling point? And if so, what did people tell you about it? Sort of like that.
Um, yeah, I guess so because in a lot of ways, if you look at like Kickstarter or Indiegogo in a bizarre way, that's that kind of like channels that entrepreneurial spirit. It's like, as I was saying, if you can't find a job, you can create your own. Like you can, go through Indiegogo or Kickstarter and get funding for like a project, and it's kind of like a way to bypass the gatekeepers. And both Indiegogo and Kickstarter and other crowdfunding sites have essentially lowered like the barrier to entry, so anyone can like pitch a project, get it funded, and create it. And that's kind of like the beauty of crowdfunding. If you can't get a job, you can create your own. So that's kind of what um, crowdfunding does. But in my unique situation, I actually like self-funded the project 100% from my corporate job, and then I kind of just used Kickstarter and Indiegogo as like a pre-order platform. Like the book is already done. I'm just putting it on Indiegogo and Kickstarter, so people can kind of pre-order this already complete project. So it's technically not really crowdfunded, but I do like that Indiegogo and Kickstarter are kind of like can be used as like pre-order platforms. So kind of getting back into like different cultures and having like the entrepreneur spirit, I noticed that like most first generation immigrants, are generally not college educated. Like many of them are just aren't college educated, and um, many of them are like blue collar or working class. And it seems like every like first generation immigrant, their like primary goal is to like give their children a better future and make sure that their children go to college. And I feel like a lot of first generation immigrants will look down on their children for pursuing careers in like blue collar or working class areas. Like they want their kids to go to college and become more like a white collar person, like obviously like a lawyer,
Mhm.
um working in tech or business or STEM. And that's I feel like that especially is true within like Korean American families, because like you know, Korean American. I don't know if you ever heard of the concept of tiger parents or tiger mom
Yeah,
or tiger
yeah.
dad. It's like a really common phenomenon with like Asians in general. And the thing is, like all Asian, first generation parents are like obsessed with making sure that their kids go to a very good college and do very well academically. And in my case, I actually ended up getting a 36 on the ACT, also 4.0 GPA. And the thing is, among like Asian Americans, that's really common for people to have like pretty much a perfect scores when it comes to academics. And like that's kind of how it is. Like there's like this huge emphasis on academics, like and becoming this, white collar worker. And that's kind of like how a lot of first generation Korean Americans, they see the American dream as making sure that their kids, go to college and pursue professional careers.
Yeah. No, so I guess there's two different things to talk about. Number one is the thing that we were just talking about, where there's that sort of pressure on a lot of people to basically integrate into society. Me myself having immigrant parents, that is a thing that I often heard. It's just sort of like, well, we brought you to this country, so you need to, become like part of this country. You can do things in this country that we never could do. And I guess it is sort of understandable in a lot of situations. particularly when you see people that like lived in their home country for uh, quite, if not the vast majority, then a sizable amount of their life, and they saw what life like was like on the other side, and then they were attracted to this other idea of this other country. They invested a large amount of money into it. They inevitably want to see their children become just like the people around them. They inevitably want to see their children succeed in this new environment, and that is what drives a lot of them to do it. So the Tiger Mom thing is definitely a real phenomenon. I've witnessed it firsthand in a lot of Koreans that I know, and not just Koreans. A lot of people from all, seeming not all, but I would say most Asian ethnicities. It is also just a sort of reflection of what being an immigrant in the United States is presumably like. But tying it back to the Kickstarter and Indiegogo, I did notice that you used it mostly as a pre-order platform, and it ties back into what I said at the very beginning of the interview and the podcast, where it was just like these platforms are very useful because they provide two things. Number one, the amount of money that you spent yourself getting this project off the ground, getting the step by step by step by step thing that you needed to do in order for the book to even begin being marketed as a real thing, right? That is something that you spend a large amount of money on, and especially when you have a corporate job, then it becomes like a huge side project that you need to invest a lot of money into when you're not working at your corporate job, when you're not working in tech. You need to, sort of put your efforts towards this creative outlet, so that it can then be sustained for later. So that definitely does help repay some of the debt that you initially accrued. But also, it is quite useful for actually selling the book because it guarantees that the people who paid, $5 to $10 to read the book many months ago, when the book comes out, they're going to have some incentive to read the book. Whereas if you just release a book into the wild, from my experience and the experience of many other authors, people are just going to be like, "Nice, you released a book," and then they'll never pick it up. When someone has made a commitment and an investment and they put money into it, then that sunken cost fallacy begins, and then they'll pick it up. And there's a big chance that after they pick it up after the first 2 pages, because they already read the first 2 pages, they'll read until the rest of the book. So it's actually a very effective tactic. And I'm sure you yourself, when you come from that background, when you sort of have to problem solve, that was something that you were inevitably thinking about. But then we come across the idea that was aforementioned, where it's just like paying off that amount of money that you spent on the book, and not only the amount of money, but the amount of time that actually sunk into it. And I'm sure you're aware that a lot of books, they do quite okay in the very beginning when you have a pre-order bonus like you do yourself. I'm sure in the next few weeks you'll see it pick up traction, but then over time, you also still see small amounts of people buying the book, buying it and picking it up. And then over time, with platforms like TikTok and Instagram, that sort of influence of the book can go back up again, because you never know when inevitably someone could find it somewhere. Someone has donated it to someone or just left it behind, and they find it in someone's house and they pick it up and they become interested in it. And then they become speaking out about how interested they are on it on social media. We have things and algorithms and systems now in this new gold rush of social media, where people are able to sort of find your work, especially through the various links that you provide on the internet regarding, your book and whatnot. And they're able to then narrow down, oh, maybe this is something I want to read. Maybe this is something that I don't want to read. So I'm sure that you're quite excited for the future potentials of your book and the success of such a, I would say like a gargantuan amount of work that has been sunk into it. Once the book is finished, well, the book is already finished, but once the process of actually advertising it is finished, once that big release is finished, once you can officially say, okay, I am done with this. I did the interviews, I did my rounds, the book is done. You can order it here and here and here now, right? I've sold these copies. Are you looking forward to making or starting any other projects that are sort of oriented towards this area? Because I know that the concept of the Rooftop Koreans is something that is, very impactful to you personally. But I suppose the name of your publishing company, the whole anti-woke books things, it sets up an initial theme for where this could go on from here. So since you've now set up like a general baseline, a company to pilot these projects off of, are there any other projects that you're looking forward to making? Are there any other ideas that you've had that you care to share? And what did you learn throughout the process of actually making and releasing this book? What excites people most about a work like this?
So yeah, so I definitely have other projects in the works. Like some of them are like just ideas in my head, and some of them are actually in the works. So I am currently working on another graphic novel, but so I'm just writing the script right now. I have not actually like sent it over to an artist or anything like that. and it hasn't been edited yet. But you know, so this second graphic novel I'm working on is actually a fantasy. So it's like a very dark fantasy that's like inspired by video games like Eco, Shadow of the Colossus, or The Last Guardian. I don't know if you ever played any of those games.
I've heard of them. I've watched people play them. That's what I can say.
Yeah, so it's kind of like inspired by that. It's like this dark fantasy, and something I would do want to do with my company, Anti-Woke Books, is that I don't want to like make keep releasing and making the same book over and over again. Like I
Yeah.
definitely want there to be like variety. So for my second graphic novel, I want to go in like the complete opposite direction, and I want it to be as different as possible from my first graphic novel. So it's going to be very, very, very different. And you know, as for the concept, it's basically about a monster and a small girl that become friends, and it takes place in an area known as the unwanted woods. If you ever want to get rid of something, you just take it to the unwanted woods. So that's where you can just throw away your garbage. You can throw away kids that you don't want, pets that you don't want. So all the unwanted, they end up in this forest known as the unwanted forest, and that's kind of like the concept I want to create, like a concept between the unwanted. So it's about a little girl and this monster, and they kind of become friends, and they're trying to find this village called the Unwanted Village, where uh like lots of like pretty much all the unwanted people gather, and they want to like go there. So that's kind of what the story is about.
Hmm.
And in addition to that, I'm also like thinking about other ideas, and some of these aren't actually in books. Like one idea that I had is creating like a proper documentary that kind of also touches on the subject of the Rooftop Koreans. Like there isn't like a proper documentary out there. Like there have been like short YouTube documentaries that are around 10 to 30 minutes at most, but there hasn't been like a true proper, over 1 hour in length documentary about the subject. So that's something that I'm definitely looking into. Another thing that I've kind of thought about in the early stages, maybe trying to get into video games. It's something that I've been thinking about. As I mentioned, I come from a tech background, so I'm very familiar with like the process of software development. So this is like an area that I'm thinking about kind of venturing into. The only issue is, with indie gaming, it's just very, very expensive.
Of course.
And another thing I've also been thinking about doing is publishing novels from like other creators. Like I want like anti-woke books to like basically publish like the type of books that no other publisher would dare to touch. So
Hmm.
that's kind of what I also want to do. And another thing I'm also working on is a prose novel that which is kind of like more of a like horror thriller type of thing that I'm also working on. That's also in the very early stages, so that will be released hopefully maybe next year. And yeah, so those are pretty much the projects that I have going on right now.
Yeah, no, dude, that's a lot of stuff to be tackling at once, especially regarding the video games part. I'm sure everybody, in the recent years has had a thought of like, oh, I want to try going into making indie games. But when it comes down to it, when you have to, work with the visual editors and stuff like that, the native applications for Windows, when you have to select between engines like Unreal Engine and Unity 3D, when then you have to learn all of these like programming languages, sort of like C Sharp. You have to, integrate all these different scripts into your game. You have to hire people to, work on the bug fixing and then troubleshooting. And then also on the coding and actual programming of the game with you, you have to design their environment. You have to do all of the graphic design, and sometimes that includes 3D or 2D assets. It's a lot of stuff to be done at once. And I'm sure that you can see the pattern where it's just like you can go from a prose novel, which in itself I can tell from you from experience it's a very difficult task to do because it is lengthy. You have to sort of describe all these things that happen normally in everyday life, but you have to sum it down to be real simple. You have to communicate it to the average, person who would otherwise be a viewer or a listener or a watcher of the general situation or a player. You have to bring them into that world using only words, which in itself is a very difficult task to do. But then you level up, then you have a graphic novel. And then, as you mentioned at the very beginning of our podcast, you can actually sketch out the characters. You can see what they look like, and the author has greater control over the narrative. But now the author has the task of, oh, I have control over the narrative, but I still need to make it entertaining to the reader. They can't just fill in the gaps and be the call author by themselves, since we can't expect them to be invested, and we have to, because they're the reader, they now have to sort of be invested in your story since you have greater control over it. You're supposed to feed, whatever they're deeming from the story. They have to be able to turn the page and be just like, oh, the thing that I wanted to happen did happen. The character that I did want to have this fate had this fate. Then it comes in the area of video games where it's even more expensive. You have way more control because you're able to pretty much make anything happen in this environment. You're giving this environment to the person as if it was real life. You're allowing them to interact with it and do whatever they want with it. But in that case, it also creates a barrier where the player can go off and do various other kinds of things, or they can just stop playing the game. And in a lot of situations, you need to invest even more cost and energy and way, way, way more time into making a game work. Just to have all these constraints of having to now entertain the player from all fronts, sound, visuals, the interactivity, the writing in of itself, which is actually quite important for games, as I'm sure you mentioned with all of these different titles. Their general themes are all very, very polished and very worked on, even if these games are rather simple sometimes, or whether they're expansive, these real world environments, as we sometimes refer to, they can actually be quite, heavy. You have to sort of make all the components work with each other. So we're seeing like a real progression of the more time and cost that you have, the more you can sort of put the reader, the player, the viewer into your world, but then the more sort of responsibility you also have. So I suppose it's exciting starting all these different projects, in the near future, because then you have real room to grow in all of these different spheres. But I suppose because the interview has been going for quite a while, I sort of want to end off towards the note of I want to ask, what has this experience like taught you most? Because I'm supposing that prior to writing, a Return of the Rooftop Koreans, prior to working on this graphic novel, you had less exposure, so to say, to creating publishing companies and creating all these giant narratives and working with artists. We already know that working with all these artists told you that it's a very intensive and time-consuming process. But I'm sort of also curious, like, how did it affect your viewpoints on creating art and helping create art and creating literary stories and creating narratives and selling products and starting companies as a whole? How did it affect, how you viewed this entire field? Coming from a tech background, which is more STEM related, we already discussed what made you want to get into actually producing your own stuff. But coming from that background, what were the biggest shocks that you encountered along the way? What was truly so special about this experience?
I would say the biggest shock will be the amount of work. Like I greatly underestimated the amount of work. The way when I first envisioned, I thought it would be like a more straightforward, easy process, and I just did not realize just how much work is involved. Like when it comes to like starting your own company and creating something. Like I don't know what it is, but I saw on this uh like this forum or something. I don't, or maybe it was on some like news site that
Mhm.
there are pretty much like no business owners that only work 40 hours a week. Like that's just not
No,
a thing.
not a
Like
thing.
work life balance, and if you want to be successful in running a business, like you have to like find a way to make your work your life.
Yeah.
And that's something that I know it's like it was really time consuming, and there were just so many components and things that I just did not anticipate that would happen. Like just lots of little like roadblocks and like it was just insane. Like here's like one thing that happened to me is that when I was trying to create my website at first, I ended up getting a DDoS OS attack, and that ended up like destroying my whole site. Like I kind of like didn't realize that my company is kind of like, a little controversial, so that's going to obviously attract like some hackers. They're going to like try to sabotage me. So that's something that I did not anticipate. And when it comes to like creating a website, like I have to like be very mindful that it's unhackable, that someone can't just go in there and like steal customer information. So I have to like put extra care into making sure that the website is secure. That is something I did not anticipate at all. And um overall, what I learned is like, as I mentioned earlier, it's better to act without thinking. Like you gotta act, you gotta keep moving forward. You can't just keep thinking nonstop, or otherwise you will get nothing done. And
Yeah.
as I mentioned, I was learning as I was going on, and I'll definitely say I learned a lot, and it is really difficult. And